rights, rape, labor, and persistent carceral violence connects with this panel, and I suppose that's why I was asked to introduce the presenters. So we have three really interesting papers, and I think it will lead to a great discussion. To my immediate right, Todd Harris, who will introduce himself when he begins his paper. And sitting next to Todd is Morgan Shanahan, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. She is a social and cultural historian of the 20th century United States and is broadly interested in the intersections of social movements, race and racism, and the history of incarceration. And then sitting next to Morgan is Dr. Bryant. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Higgins. Yeah. Higgins Bryant. Dr. Bryant received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in English. His dissertation was on the 20th century U.S. prison writing as intellectual labor. He has served as a lecturer at the California State University, Chico, teaching American literature, multi-ethnic science fiction, U.S. and global prison writing, working class literature, and film courses. He has published on the Soledad brother George Jackson and has forthcoming articles on Carl Chessman, early film adaptation of Jack London's short stories, that should be interesting, and the intersection of working class studies and critical prison studies. And he just accepted a tenure track position, congratulations, at Chico State, which sounds fabulous.
Cool. All right, I'm going to go first.
But before you do, can you introduce yourself too, so that we can get sort of all the introductions?
Sure. It's Todd Harris. I'm a management professor at Bridgewater State University. I'm a colleague with Megan and Colby's as well. My background is actually in management consulting. Spent about 20 years on sort of the corporate side. One of the projects that presenting today is a data set based on some work with a client. And I think from a research perspective, issues of fairness and justice are my things. It's lovely being with everyone today.
Cool. Okay. So before I give my talk today, the Jailhouse lawyer is a liminal figure, frivolous litigation, meritless labor. I want to give two brief acknowledgments. The first is of the Sitalkat people, indigenous peoples of this area upon whose ancestral land we are currently sitting, walking, and working at our conference. And also to the many prisoners, both alive and dead, whom I have researched and written and are continuing to write about. I don't want to exploit them and their labor, just the opposite. I hope that my scholarship can contribute in a meaningful way to emancipation and liberation. Carol Chessman's story is one that ends badly for its narrator, although for a time he was one of the most famous prisoners in the world. The popular press dubbed him the Red Light Bandit for a series of robberies and 2 sex crimes he supposedly committed by imitating a policeman flashing a red light at his victims. For these crimes, a jury sentenced Chessman to death for violating California's version of the Little Lindbergh Law, a rarely used law that made kidnapping a capital offense if the hostage was injured in the process. Many complications ensued during Chessman's trial. He maintained until his execution that policemen had beaten a false confession out of him. Legal scholars who reviewed the case years later found ample evidence of prosecutorial and judicial misconduct during the original trial. But most importantly, the court reporter assigned to the case died 2 days before Chessman's sentencing, which made completing a court transcript impossible. He had recorded the notes in a highly idiosyncratic shorthand, and many pages were simply illegible. And it was this detail, the incomplete and therefore potentially inadmissible court transcript, upon which Chessman focused much of his appeals. He lived for 12 years on death row, where he authored a memoir trilogy and a posthumously published novel, in addition to producing a staggering corpus of legal work on his own behalf, as well as for other convicts, all of which he authored himself. But despite 8 separate stays of execution, Chessman was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin on May 2nd, 1960. Most of the critical discussion about Chessman since his execution focuses on his guilt or innocence and his immediate impact in the 1950s, particularly regarding his role in a national and even global debate over capital punishment. Although I touch on these issues in a larger article, of which I'm presenting a very minute piece today, and here is the kind of organization of the longer piece that's forthcoming. Today I just want to briefly discuss how courts and the public received his legal work, because a fundamental question about the value of Chessman's labor permeated the many layers of discourse in and about his legal battles. At issue was the fact that Chessman bent his considerable intellectual energy and will toward a series of legal questions that many at the time considered frivolous and without merit, terms that would gain considerable legal and symbolic traction among conservative circles from the 1960s onward, as more prisoners produced their own legal documents and pursued self-representation in court. I argue that the conservative critiques about Chessman's legal work were at heart judgments about the value of his labor, judgments that were handed down largely outside the confines of the narrow legal definitions of frivolousness and meritlessness. We must consider why Chessman was ultimately put to death, despite every indication that he did in fact propose important procedural questions, as well as repeatedly demonstrate that the courts violated his due process. Ultimately, I argue that Chessman was effectively put to death because he set a troubling precedent in his ability to use and reproduce legal discourse, one viewed as contemptuous of the law. From the original trial forward, Chessman's decision to represent himself and to produce his own legal documents continually called into question the mechanics and the business of the law itself. Lawyers, judges, politicians, and everyday citizens viewed him as an interloper, a phony whose intellectual activities made a mockery of U.S. jurisprudence and someone who needed to be dealt with accordingly. Thus, his execution functioned equally as a means of deterring future jailhouse legal activity as it did for punishing his past crimes. His legal work and life story illuminate in rather dramatic fashion the early shifting boundaries of what constitutes permissible, valuable intellectual labor by convicts, and that which the state deems frivolous and worthless, boundaries that Chessman contested and altered through his writing, even if that writing did not help to save his own life. So I'm going to skip all the way to almost the very end of this forthcoming piece to talk about the kind of public perception of his work. The tedium and seething contempt felt by judges and lawyers tired of his nearly decade-long appeals process circulates in Chessman v. Dixon, a 1960 decision handed down 3 months before his execution by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. The judge composing the brief, Arizona Judge Richard Harvey Chambers, sarcastically commends Chessman's legal team. Quote, petitioner is represented by able counsel and one must give them an A for ingenuity, but such ingenuity just doesn't put water in the bottom of the well where there is none. He points to a basic weakness in our government system that a case like this takes so long, but is adamant that he cannot see how we can offer life under a death sentence as a prize for one who can stall the processes for a given number of years, especially when in the end it appears the prisoner never really had any good legal points. In his conclusion, he destroys Chessman's case and character by arguing, quote, we are told of his agonies on death row, this is a long quote in front of you. True, it would be hell for most people, but here is no ordinary man. In his appearances in court, one sees an arrogant, truculent man, the same qualities that Regina and Mary, the sex crimes victims, met, spewing vitriol on one person after another. We see an exhibitionist who never before had such an opportunities for exhibition. All of this I get from the record, and I think he has heckled his keepers long enough. This is a judge, an important judge. Chambers was hardly alone in his vociferous condemnation of Chessman's legal work. What is notable is the fact that a judge, a man supposedly tasked with upholding the austerity and dignity of the law and its appellate apparatuses, would stoop to author an opinion whose primary purposes were not to engage in an orderly rebuttal of a petition, but to paint an individual with so broad and so damning a brush. But then again, by this point, Chambers was not only speaking as a judge in this opinion, he was also articulating a common public sentiment that is a decade long, sort of in the making, voicing the collectively held beliefs of those who had grown tired of hearing about the famous arrogant resident of San Quentin's death house. The novelty is that Chambers did so in a vernacular that would surely generate the next day's headlines. Chessman's appeals were vexing because on the one hand, he was a man desperately exploring every single legal means available to him to delay his impending execution. On the other hand, he faced a tremendously divided public and an incensed, antagonistic host of state representatives and conservative media commentators who all argued that Chessman was not, indeed, actually making the most of his final constitutionally afforded opportunities. That he was almost always operating from within the law was largely lost on these commentators. Instead, his detractors felt he was making a mockery of the law by playing games and exploiting technicalities while increasing his celebrity status and helping to stoke a growing global opposition to the death penalty. According to the Los Angeles Mirror, the delays constituted a lighthearted game of musical chairs with the able assistance of some members of the state judiciary. One angry citizen observed that trials have often become courts of skill and manipulation of technicalities like games of chess, and that our softness of heart must have spread to our heads to allow a brute like Chessman to escape justice on such flimsy technicalities. Federal Judge Louis E. Goodman compared Chessman's defense to casino gambling when writing of our nickel-in-the-slot administration of criminal justice. California Assemblywoman Dorothy Donahue claimed that Chessman was perfecting the technique of last-minute obstructionism and thereby displaying complete contempt, a contemptuous attitude of law and order. The most vociferous and fiery opinion is found in the Los Angeles Times editorial published after his execution entitled "Chessman Will Be With Us." The unnamed editorialist condemns Chessman and his counsel for making, quote, a dirty trifle of habeas corpus, playing with a jewel on a dung heap. And he lambasts Chessman's legal stagecraft of dulling one or two of his legal points of appeal at a time, while putting off the executioner with each play. He laments that the greatest of writs became a legal quibble, the tinker tool of smart lawyers who seemed always to find a susceptible judge. And then the editorial ends by actually quoting Richard Chambers that I've already quoted above. Quote, I think he has heckled his keeper long enough. Clearly this chorus of condemnation shows why biographers Mocklin and Woodfield would write that Chessman operated originally in a matter inept and then later offensive to the courts. In the much longer piece, after reading Chessman's writs and then examining the legal definitions of frivolity and applying these definitions to Chessman's case, I demonstrate that none of his appeals were indeed frivolous, a point backed up by later by legal scholars who note a number of prosecutorial and judicial missteps during the entire process. So this forces us to ask why he was executed in the first place. And I argue that much of the criticism of his work is actually about labor. You can maybe hear the echoes of in this kind of long list of things going on here. In the simplest terms, the backlash against Chessman's appeal sought to discredit his labor as useless and without merit. Hence the chorus of condemnation referring to his work as an elaborate game, with Chessman playing or toying with the law. The supposed worthlessness of his legal efforts derived mainly from the fact that Chessman chose to represent himself, and in so doing actively encroached on a territory reserved for professional lawyers. It was his apparent arrogance in choosing to defend himself that many judges cited when they simultaneously acknowledged the validity of his legal arguments, but nevertheless denied him further recourse to argue or pursue them. And it's kind of remarkable to see in almost every judicial opinion that the judge will say, yes, he was correct. There is legal merit here. Nevertheless, it does not matter. That kind of move happens in almost every single appeal rebuttal that I've read. Moreover, although Chessman never seems to have been officially accused of contempt of court, he nevertheless towed that line in his position as both accused criminal and lawyer. In fact, rather than simply committing one disruptive act of contempt of court, cussing out a judge, whatever you want to call it, Chessman seemed to embody and make manifest contempt of court, or at least contempt for the law, a routine accusation against Chessman in his decision to continually represent himself. What these individuals seemed to care most about was the ritual of the law, the preservation and enactment of juridical spaces, rules, and roles and norms, legal decorum, in other words, that Chessman as an interloper could only play at or make a game of or otherwise demean or mock in bad faith because he was not a trained and credentialed lawyer. Chessman's arrogance rendered his prodigious labor meritless without value of any kind. We might think about the impulse to doubly judge and condemn, made manifest in Chessman's initial conviction as well as in the continual denial of his appeals and of his case's so-called frivolity. Michel Foucault argues that modern law certainly still condemns crimes and offenses, but embedded in these juridical decisions are other kinds of judgments about, quote, passions, instincts, anomalies, infirmities, maladjustments, effects of environment or heredity. Acts of aggression are punished, so also through them is aggressivity. Rape, but at the same time perversions, murders, but also drives and desires, as Foucault. Foucault's argument also applies to Chessman's legal career after the trial, and this is not simply because people believe that his appeals consistently deferred justice. That a criminal could, through misappropriating the law, further taint the entire legal process itself, and by extension American democracy, and this is the 1950s we're talking about, Cold War American hegemony, right? That somebody could taint that a criminal could further taint the legal process itself was certainly one facet of the outrage generated by his appeals. But the legal emphasis on decorum, the refrain that his case would have had more legal merit had he simply used a lawyer like everyone else, is itself a powerful judgment about the business of the law. The law governs all subjects and all facets of life, but only those who have been credentialed and recognized by the law may use and mold it. Imposters who do not respect the law and attempt to use it to their own ends ultimately denigrate it, so the thinking goes. Thus, the profusion of legal opinion, denial of appeals, and pronouncements produced in an effort to finally end Chessman's life also serve as a kind of deterrent to future jailhouse lawyers. It is significant that many of the judgments denying his appeals again recognize the implicit legal merits of his writs. Because of the nature of U.S. jurisprudence, most notably its complete reliance on precedent, on the seemingly infinite archive of previous opinions and law that serve as a bedrock and reference for all future decisions, judges associated with Chessman's appeals process have archived both their recognition that his case could have been justiciable pending certain requisite conditions, namely having a real lawyer, and that in the end it simply didn't matter. The energy in writing that the law could summon up in its own defense overshadows the monumental discursive effort that Chessman produced on his own behalf. His name and place would be footnoted in the historical and legal record as someone who attempted to take on the law and failed. He would serve as an example to any and all future jailhouse lawyers who think that they may have a real case that their work will most likely be defined as frivolous and without merit. Dragon Milanovic and Jim Thomas warn us of two dangers in writing about the prisoner litigant and his work. The first is romanticizing what is normally only modest change brought on by jailhouse lawyering. The second is more important. Some critics correctly suggest that even reform occurring through litigation may increase coercive control by strengthening legitimate prior practices or by masking illicit ones under the cover of law. And because some of the writs produced by prison litigants challenge institutional policy and even bring suits against individual guards and administrators, they are often singled out for extra institutional scrutiny and punishment. Citing a study from the early 1990s, Mumia Abu-Jamal asserts that jailhouse lawyers are the individuals most likely to be punished by prison administrators because their labor challenges how the joint is run. Quote, jailhouse lawyers force prisons to change their formal rules and regulations, especially when they're illogical or downright silly, and furthest administrators unleash their disciplinary arsenal with special vehemence. That is why in every hole in every prison you will find some jailhouse lawyers who are there on pretextual and frequently false disciplinary reports. On many levels, this is a discursive battle, and according to Abu-Jamal, each side must operate in relation to the text, either pretextually, which is the state's preference, inventing reasons outside the actual labor that jailhouse lawyers do in order to punish them, since to punish them for their constitutionally protected work is in fact illegal, or on the jailhouse lawyer side through the submission of the text itself. We see in Chessman's case, however, the state does not even need to produce pretext to silence its most vociferous prisoners. He was correct, and Chessman nevertheless choked to death on poison fumes in 1960. Because of the sheer differential in power dynamics between Chessman and the state, because his use of the law was dwarfed by the vast reserves of legal precedent that the state could draw upon in order to execute him, it has proved exceedingly difficult not to elevate his work to political activism, because his work and his example proved to be more effective for others than it ever did for himself. If the ultimate goals of his self-education and writing were to stay alive and not be the victim of state-sanctioned execution, he failed. We can only speculate about alternative endings to his life's narrative or his execution on a material and historical fact. But what his life's work does offer is invaluable instruction regarding the potential of prison-based intellectual labor, even in the face of material constraint and oppression. And Chessman's example would prove to be an important one for the next generation of prison writers, particularly those of California. As San Quentin historian Eric Cummins notes, Chessman taught the world much. To his prison keepers, his example had shown how much trouble educating inmates could cause them. Prison administrations after him would initially make it much harder for inmates to read and write. We're talking about the civil rights movement and sort of militant black prisoners in this group, right? But to the inmates themselves, Chessman had given a precious gift. This death row prisoner provided a model of how a convict could gain power through writing and education and then use it to seek his own freedom. Although Chessman would die, his 12 years on death row is an excellent example of social praxis, of a consciously dialectical relationship with the world, because it changed the way we look at prisoners, and because his work, and the work of many others he influenced, would indirectly strengthen our own status as citizens and people. His defense of his own civil rights, as someone on the inside and outside of the institution, working in the interstices and the borders of the law, has influenced and strengthened our own civil rights. Thank you very much. We're going to do musical chairs.
unfortunately. Sorry, guys. A live stream of technical difficulties. Sorry. Hold on. I'm gonna have to go in my email again and get it, unless it's gonna. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah, it's not coming up on you.
Oh, it's not? Okay.
It's not. There it is. There it is.
Oh, there we go. Oh, it looks totally different on my screen. I apologize.
She's not lying.
Yeah. Thanks again to Dr. Higgins for his acknowledgement of the Native peoples of Long Island, and also for his acknowledgement of the incarcerated subjects of his research. I echo those concerns in my work as well. This is from a chapter of my dissertation, which is on the connection between paroled prisoners and labor and employment in Illinois in the Progressive era. So I'll just get started with the paper. In 1898, the Chicago Tribune claimed that men and women on parole from Illinois penitentiaries were responsible for half of the city's most shocking crimes. Though the newspaper editorial board called on the responsible parties to defend the apparent laxity of the release process and of parole supervision, they did not charge specific political actors with this negligence. It seems that the Tribune wasn't quite sure whom to blame for poor supervision and criminal behavior among former prisoners. There are a number of reasons for this confusion, but they all come back to a central characteristic of the parole system in Illinois and of most early parole systems in the United States, the fact that they're very diffusive. So there's no kind of top-down structure of authority and supervision in place. So the Tribune could not be sure where to direct its call for reform because the parole system depended upon thousands of individuals and businesses willing to supervise and employ ex-offenders. As such, employment relationships and labor practices were integral to the expansion of penal control in the early 20th century. So this presentation will analyze the role of labor in the development of the parole system in Illinois. Parole laws, which were passed by most state legislatures in the early 20th century, provide for the early release of prisoners before the completion of their sentences on the promise of good behavior and employment. While historians have written extensively on the use of contract labor within correctional institutions, the exploitation of Southern prisoners on the chain gang, and conflicts between labor unions and prison industries, we have only begun to explore the ways in which connections between industry and the penitentiary shape the parole system. Criminologists and penologists considered steady, productive labor essential to the rehabilitation process, a process that was expected to occur both within the institution and after the prisoner was released. Parole may have been initially designed and implemented in part to complete the rehabilitation process, but state officials and employers of paroled men and women quickly sought out ways to make a profit at the expense of the person on parole and his or her reformation and transition to society. This presentation will illustrate the ways in which private industry benefited from the exploitation of vulnerable ex-offenders, but it will also show how paroled men and women challenged the restrictions of parole. I explore the ways in which both employers and ex-prisoners were able to use new parole laws to their own advantage. In doing so, those influenced by the parole system were able to help determine the evolution of parole in its first 15 years of existence in Illinois, from roughly 1895 to 1910. At this moment, the way in which the parole system would work in practice was still under negotiation. Employers, prison officials, and paroled men and women tested its boundaries and contributed to the evolution of parole legislation and its implementation. The supervisory function of employers was integral to the early operation of the parole system. The Illinois parole law required paroled men and women to secure employment prior to their release from corrections institutions. And due to state budgetary constraints, employers became the primary custodians of paroled men and women. The number of parole agents employed by the state was limited, and paroled persons were scattered throughout Illinois, meaning that agents would need to travel very long distances to see their charges. Because this quandary transferred much of the supervisory responsibility over paroled men and women to their employers, employers often used their authority to their advantage. Many employers attempted to sign parole papers in an effort to obtain cheap and malleable laborers, but others took their roles in the supervisory process a little bit more seriously. Indeed, the parole process ensured that employers had an economic stake in coaxing good behavior out of their charges, because steady and diligent workers led to greater profit for their businesses. But less scrupulous employers could threaten to return their charges to prison in order to compel the paroled prisoner to work for lower wages or labor for much longer hours than other laborers. While many prospective paroled men and women wrote to former employers to find positions for the duration of their parole period, probably in part to ensure that they would not have to endure these exploitative relationships, business owners eager to tap a source of inexpensive labor often contacted Joliet and other state correctional facilities in Illinois to request laborers. Unfortunately, job opportunities provided by the warden and by voluntary associations devoted to aiding ex-prisoners were not plentiful enough to provide every friendless prisoner with an employer willing to sign their parole agreement, so a lot of people ended up getting caught up in these very exploitative relationships with their employers. When, quote, 99 men out of 100 would not sign a parole to give a man work that comes out of prison, end quote, wardens and inmates had to get very creative, and employers found it much easier to actually game this system. For inmates, a successful parole sometimes meant concealing criminal records by obtaining permission for the warden to have somebody other than their employer sign their monthly parole papers. For wardens, the difficulties encountered by ex-inmates seeking jobs meant finding employers who would hire ex-prisoners for 12-month periods sight unseen. And for employers, the parole system meant an opportunity to hire laborers who would often work for much lower than average wages. This opportunity, though, was not without its drawbacks. The year-long commitment must have seemed daunting for farmers who tended to hire seasonal workers. Employers were also wary of offering jobs to ex-prisoners they had never met, perhaps worrying that they might be more likely to dip into the company coffers or to leave town without notice. Besides, employers were contractually tasked with keeping a closer watch on paroled men and women than they would have for other laborers that they were employing at the time. So those offering jobs to prospective parolees were not required to house them or to record their movements, but they did sign papers indicating that they would, and this is an excerpt from one of the documents. There's thousands upon thousands of these in the archives, so I just excerpted one. So they indicated that they would, quote, promise to take a friendly interest in the paroled man or woman, to counsel and direct him or her in that which is good, and to promptly report to the warden of the Illinois State Penitentiary any unnecessary absence from work, any tendency to low and evil associations, or any violations of the conditions of his or her parole. And I'm changing the his to his or her because they just crossed it out and changed it to her usually. So while some might have been very leery of these conditions, other employers signed many, many similar agreements, hiring a large number of paroled men and women over a short period of time. So some of these supervisors intended for men and women to move on relatively quickly and transfer the responsibility of parole to another employer who might pay them higher wages, but others applied for the supervision of paroled men and women that they intended to underpay and overwork. Bound by parole agreements and marked by criminal records, these men and women experienced great difficulty leaving exploitative positions for better job opportunities. So I'm just going to do one example of such an exploitative relationship. So in the spring and the summer of 1905, a flurry of letters addressed to Warden E.J. Murphy arrived at the largest prison in Illinois, Joliet. Frank Mara, this guy you see up here, wrote to express discontent with the actions of the employer who had signed his parole papers. Mara believed that W.H. Wright had failed to keep his word, and that he had not abided by the terms of the contract that he signed with the penitentiary. Warden Murphy might have been inclined to distrust Mara, who had already violated 2 parole agreements, but despite his previous failures, Mara claimed that the 3rd time was the charm, and that he was now, quote, determined to do what is right and work for an honest living. Mara initially reached out to Wright to inquire after an open position for a mechanic in Wright's business in Danville. Shortly after, Wright wrote to assure him of his new opportunity to make good. Quote, I will parole you and give you as good a home as your father would, and you won't have to work any harder than I do. End quote. Wright further promised to assist Mara in any way he could to set him back on the path to productive citizenship. He was a lot less clear, though, about what he was actually going to pay Mara, writing, quote, I do not know how good a mechanic you are. It would be hard for me to say. When he signed Frank Mara's parole agreement on April 19, 1905, he agreed to pay him $7.50 per month plus board. He probably recognized that this was a very small amount of money, unlikely to satisfy the warden, so he added a note underneath the amount, which you probably cannot read, but it is up here. Quote, if he is a good man to work and faithful to his duty, I will pay him more. I will do the fair thing with him. Though Wright eventually agreed to pay Mara $15 per month, conflict over fair wages extended into Mara and Wright's working relationship, prompting Mara to claim that he was being treated unfairly. Soon after Mara's arrival in Danville, he wrote to Warden Murphy to inform him that Wright was withholding his wages. When the Joliet warden responded to the complaint, he requested that Mara provide proof of Wright's actions. In reply, Mara suggested that Murphy write to Chester Penitentiary, quote, where Mr. Wright got 4 men out and asked the warden what became of them, and they will inform you better than I can. Moreover, according to Mara, Wright told him that parole was intended to be an extended form of punishment for men who had been in prison, and that paroled men were forced to work for lower than average wages for 1 year as a way to pay their debts to society. Wright himself later admitted to having paroled 2 men from Chester Penitentiary at very low wages. He also informed Warden Murphy that he was withholding Mara's wages until Mara could prove himself trustworthy. As Mara would have been sent back to Joliet if he left Wright without permission from Murphy, the paroled man was stuck in Danville without money until he could convince the warden that employment under Wright was intolerable. Fortunately for Mara, Warden Murphy sensed a flight risk. After Mara had worked for Wright for only 3 months, Warden Murphy transferred him to another job. While Mara convinced Warden Murphy to allow him to leave Wright's employ and continue his parole, others could not stand the indignity of low wages, restrictions on their movements, and the supervision of bosses who took advantage of them. Many paroled men and women who left their employers probably did have cause to complain. Laborers on parole were frequently paid far less for their work than the national average wage for their industries. So for example, in 1900, the L.C. Kruger Company, building razors and movers, hired paroled man Lewis Marshall as a clerk for $12 per week. And assuming that Marshall worked every single week that year with no days off, he would only have made $624, a sum which was almost $400 less than the national average for clerks. Many men placed on parole elected to skip town rather than spend a 12-month period earning little and adhering to the rules set out by the parole agreement. Paroled men and women often exploited the leeway inherent in the system of parole supervision, much to the chagrin of their employers. Many of them got away with leaving town to start anew elsewhere in the country for months or years without being arrested or reincarcerated. Just as frequently, though, employers or agents of voluntary organizations contacted the warden with information regarding a former prisoner's delinquency. With so few parole agents available to locate and to check in with ex-prisoners, employers were crucial to the supervision process. Aside from the commission of crime while on parole, paroled men or women were most often arrested and taken back to the penitentiary for poor job performance, idleness, or intoxication reported by their employers. So these are not super highly dangerous offenses. They're pretty run-of-the-mill, ordinary things that people were just sent back to prison for. Reverend A.C. Todd, superintendent of the Illinois Industrial Association, an organization slated to provide temporary employment for discharged prisoners who, quote, manifest a disposition to lead corrupt lives, often found himself writing to the warden to notify them of an ex-convict's delinquent activities. Charles S. Bain caused Reverend Dodds more trouble than many of the parole cases he shouldered as superintendent. On the surface, Bain appeared much more likely to experience success on parole than most men in Joliet. He was a college-educated Scottish immigrant from a wealthy and respectable family, respectable as assessed by the warden. So, rich, educated, good handwriting, essentially.
No low associations.
No low associations. He had been working as a clerk in Kane County at the time of his arrest for embezzlement in October 1896. Paroled in May of 1898, Bain was dismissed from or left approximately 7 different jobs in his first 3 weeks in free society. Bain made his way to Chicago on his release and commenced work in the Illinois Industrial Association's broom factory for $6 a week under the supervision of Reverend Dodds. According to Dodds, Bain was unable to successfully perform tasks in the factory, so Dodds contacted a publisher in hopes of finding him a more permanent position. Charles Bain proved, quote, an utter failure at this and 4 subsequent positions before informing his landlady that he was canvassing for books and making $3 per day. A lot of money in 1898. His landlady soon contacted Reverend Dodds. Bain, she said, was not busy selling books from door to door, but instead could be found, quote, lying around the house or out riding the bicycle of another boarder. Sounds like a pretty good life. After Dodds breakfasted with Bain one morning, Bain left at a reasonable hour as if to go to work. Reverend Dodds was not fooled by Bain's ruse and dropped in for a surprise visit at Bain's rooms later that morning. In an easily imaginable scene of idleness, Bain was sitting on the front steps of his home and reading a paper. Catching sight of Dodds, Bain gestured to the paper, remarked, quote, this won't buy the baby a frock, and strode away hurriedly as if to get to work. In recounting this story to the warden, A.C. Dodds closed his report with the conclusion that Bain was, quote, a brilliant and successful liar and not to be trusted. But Bain would remain on the streets despite Dodds' assessment. And this was a pretty unusual assessment coming from Reverend Dodds, who's usually pretty lenient about his parole prisoners and didn't tend to send a lot of people back to the penitentiary. So there's a few reasons for why this might have happened. The first is that Bain's initial crime was a nonviolent one, which perhaps led the warden to conclude the time and expense involved in arresting and incarcerating him again would be unnecessary. Further, as a highly educated ex-convict amongst a majority of common school educated paroled men and women, Bain had several advantages in the highly subjective early parole system. It's crucial to remember here exactly how much weight the warden's opinion carried in parole cases. So while the Board of Pardons approved or rejected initial applications for parole, it was up to the warden to issue orders for the arrest of delinquent paroled men and women. So after a few months on parole, Bain found himself pleading with the warden for the continuation of his freedom, despite his inability to hold a job. Unlike most ex-prisoners, Bain was a skilled wordsmith. Along with his parole report, he sent an elegantly written letter claiming that he had obtained permanent employment and begging the warden to give him a second chance. Bain acknowledged that he had, quote, behaved very foolishly while on parole, and that he had associated with disreputable men. He expressed remorse for his actions, assuring the warden that he was, quote, not wholly evil, believe me, but that he was, quote, easily led. Perhaps he believed that these claims allowed him to shift part of the blame for his idleness. Or maybe this admission about his natural inclination to follow his peers, and in doing so fall into bad behavior, simply allowed Bain to argue that he would make good, provided he kept away from, quote, evil companions and bad places. So I'll sum this up by saying that this was not the case for most prisoners, because they could not write eloquently to say that they were remorseful for their actions and that they would try their best to make good in beautiful handwriting. My God, this guy's handwriting. Usually, letters were illegible, and as such, employers really had the upper hand. They could say, you know, this guy's not really doing his job. I think you should take him back, right? And poor men and women, a lot of women were paroled to family members, so family members could have a lot of influence other than just the sort of authority of the long arm of the state over these women. And so Bain's case is a very, very unusual one. So as the stories of Frank Marr and Charles Bain have shown, the early years of the parole system were characterized by constant negotiation between wardens, employers, and paroled men and women themselves. Stipulations of the parole law were often not followed because they could not be enforced, limited as parole agents were by budgetary concerns and the nascence of criminal identification technologies. So fingerprinting is not really a thing until the 1920s in most states. Illinois employed only 9 parole agents to supervise around 2,000 individuals on parole in the state for over 20 years after the parole law was first enacted, and this 2,000 number keeps rising and rising over the years. So therefore, men and women who were dissatisfied with the conditions of their parole agreements or their employment could disappear relatively easily, especially if they moved out of state and went straight. But despite the contested nature of the early parole system, wardens and the parole board were able to control the conditions of release from corrections institutions. This talk highlighted a sample of my dissertation research from a chapter that illustrates how continuous negotiation processes among wardens, employers, and paroled men and women helped to shape the development of parole legislation, the evolution of the supervisory process, and changes in the rehabilitative ideal over the first few decades of the 20th century. It was these on-the-ground negotiations, rather than high legislative or academic machinations, that truly shaped the early development of parole in the U.S. Thank you very much.
Well, folks, just give me a minute or so here, or an hour or so here. Okay, success. Right, yeah, there it is. So again, wonderful to be with everyone this morning. My name is Todd Harris. I'm in the management department at Bridgewater State University. So a step up or push down statistical relationships among race, criminal record, and performance in an entry-level job. So I'm here, my esteemed colleague Colby is here, Jakari Griffith, my other esteemed colleague, cannot be with us this morning. He is in South Carolina developing some relationships for internships for our students at Fuji, of all places. And Jakari was the person that really got me interested in the topic of criminal record and employment. And basically, after talking with him about the issue over the last couple of months or so, I realized that with some of my old corporate contacts, we might actually be able to get some real data, really for the first time, looking at this relationship. So let's jump right in. So background of the population, and I suspect most of you know the literature and the background and the data better than I do. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, which really focuses on people at work. But you know, in terms of this particular issue, this particular subject, roughly 1 in 3 Americans have some type of criminal record. In dealing with companies in my corporate career, I could certainly say, you know, firsthand that if someone had some type of interaction with the justice system, all other things being equal, the employer, for any number of reasons, would certainly shy away from that particular candidate. From a data point of view, or from a literature point of view, prison records or evidence of felony convictions reduce an employer's motivation to hire. Employers prefer employees without criminal backgrounds. And of course, we likely all know that class and race are fairly fairly robust predictors of people's interactions in the U.S. with the criminal justice system. Oftentimes, in talking to Fortune 500 companies and the people that are responsible for developing their hiring processes and approaches, what you often hear is that, well, we want to do the right thing, we want to be helpful, but why should we potentially take a chance, both in terms of legal exposure and also any sort of fallout from a publicity standpoint. So that's sort of what's going on the ground. Probability of jail by race and class. Apologize if this isn't overly legible, but essentially the net of it is that the sort of the more upper class one is, and the whiter one is, the much less likely they are, or one is, to end up in jail or have any other connection with the criminal justice system. Literature review. So if you think about what most scholars in criminal justice, in economics, and sociology, interestingly, there really aren't that many folks on the management side of the academy looking at this issue. But basically, what most of the research has looked at thus far basically includes this stuff. Well, managerial attitudes towards applicants with criminal backgrounds. One of the ways that organizations select employees is the use of these criminal background checks. That's a technique that's certainly been expanding in use over the last 15 or 20 years, and it's really becoming much broader. Concerns about reputation and image threats to firms. So again, gee, we would like to take a chance on this particular individual, but what does that communicate to our current employees? What does that communicate to prospective customers? So sort of the marketing aspect. Applicants and interviewers. One of the things that we found interesting is that evidently when an interviewer has had an interaction with the criminal justice system, him or herself, that tends to impact their view of an applicant that has had a connection with that system as well. And then characteristics of the applicant in terms of age, gender, and race. There's a real hole here in that very few folks, and this might be the first study of its kind, have actually really looked at the relationship between whether someone has a criminal record and whether they actually are either better or worse at their job. So essentially, that was the hole that Colby, Jakari, and I were really trying to fill. So, well, boy, there you go, right? Our contribution, very little empirical research addresses whether criminal records actually predict job performance. Organizations are constantly on the hunt for data points that are going to more effectively forecast who is going to be more likely to be successful in a given role versus not, right? So whether that's intelligence, whether that's personality, whether that's emotional intelligence, whether that's level of education, and they throw all of these data points oftentimes into an algorithm and let that drive decision making. Again, not much research, if any, on, well, is this actually an effective predictor about who can do the job or who can't? So here's the methodology for this particular project. Again, reached out to an old client. It's a Fortune 500 television company. Everyone would know the name. And basically told the director of HR, SVP of HR, what we were working on, and asked her, gee, do you think you could help us get some data? And she said, well, you'll owe me, but yes, I can. So over 1,000 telephone call center representatives working in 4 different physical locations in the United States. We weren't able to get data or information in terms of demographics on everyone. We got what we could, given that it was a corporate sample. Mostly women, mostly white, 203 with high school education, 95 college, the remainder unknown. Weren't able to get age information, unfortunately. So here's what we were able to look at on the demographic side. Criminal convictions, so basically we were able to get a data point. Have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony? Race, we were able to get gender, we were able to get tenure, so how long they had worked for the organization, and then their level of education, at least in some points, and then job performance. So we're able to look at 5 different elements of job performance, and again, this is a call center, so let's say you go to flip on your television, gee, not working, you call this company, these are the folks that you talk to. Average handle time is basically just how long it takes them to resolve the call. Quality assurance is essentially how well the call went. So did the individual call center rep do what the company wants them to do? Transfer rate essentially is if that person can't figure out the problem, they have to transfer it to someone else in the company. That tends to be quite expensive. Callback rate is essentially, evidently the person didn't resolve the problem. The customer had to call the company back to get it rectified, and then the number of claims. Essentially, with the exception of quality assurance, higher numbers here are indicative of worse performance, right? You want the average handle time to be low, and so forth. One of the advantages of these particular data points is that this is how this organization runs its business. These matter. So, a couple of things that jumped out in terms of the data. Race and criminal record, certainly there was a fairly robust connection and correlation there. Essentially, the less white someone was, the more likely they would have been to have been convicted of a felony or misdemeanor. Education and criminal records, sort of interesting. In this particular data set, more education actually predicted more likelihood to have been connected to the criminal justice system. And the only connection statistically between any of the performance records or any of the performance data and criminal record was with this one particular performance criterion, quality assurance. And it's a fairly low, although statistically significant correlation. The statistical significance really driven by the large sample size. In terms of running a business, quite candidly, it's essentially meaningless. ANOVA results. I won't take us deeply into the weeds of the statistics, but fundamentally, as an HR professional and as an organizational psychologist, I would look at criminal record in this case and say, you know what? Doesn't really predict whether someone is going to be good at this particular job. People with a criminal record aren't necessarily any better, but they're not necessarily any worse either. So again, as you think about those correlations between the things that organizations can look at to predict job performance, at least in this particular study, one position, one company, we're not seeing a robust relationship. Implications. So again, at least in this particular case, doesn't look like, at least the way we were able to measure it, criminal record effectively predicted anything really of consequence and interest to the employer. As an industrial organizational psychologist, essentially when you look at how organizations hire people, basically a well-functioning selection system has 2 aspects to it. Number one, it's fair. right? It makes decisions based on work-related behavior. So there's sort of a fairness and a legal aspect to it. And then secondarily, well, it's effective in actually hiring people that are more likely to be successful in the role, whatever the role is. Based on what we're seeing in this data, criminal record does not substantially contribute to either of those goals, either fairness or accuracy. One of the things that Jakari and Colby and I have discussed that's sort of interesting, given that this is an entry-level job, Fortune 500, service sector, often this is going to potentially be sort of that first step up into sort of a professional career. And if people are being screened out at that early point in their lives, in their careers, essentially they're never getting into the game in the first place. So it might be that much more pernicious, that much more consequential. Focusing on actual work behaviors may help discredit the implicitly shared view that criminal records predict or impact job performance. So looking at what people have actually done in their lives and actually accomplished, as opposed to using something like criminal record. Oftentimes when you talk to employers, whether they consciously do it or not, they use criminal record as a convenient sort of potential proxy for some other psychological construct that they might be interested in. So essentially, do they say, well, if someone has a criminal record, can we extrapolate from that and say the person has trouble with impulse control, isn't as conscientious, isn't as reliable, all of these other things. So helping employers sort of perhaps rethink that. So yeah, we're excited about the work. We just submitted it to a organizational psychology journal, so it's under review there, and we'll see what happens. So that's it from my standpoint. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you. What three wonderful and interesting papers, when paired together, remind us of the centrality of labor to mass incarceration. And that's one of the things, I think, that to some extent has been extracted from the discussion. Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls incarceration the incapacitation of incarceration. Or Louis Bourcant calls it the warehousing of the poor. And it is all of those things. But in the same way that there's a critical critique of mass incarceration as a kind of neo-slavery, slavery was, of course, a system of racial oppression, but it was also a system of labor, extraction and coercion, and prisons have always functioned in the same vein. And we're reminded of that here in three different ways. Nathaniel Bryant's paper gets us to think about intellectual production as labor, and intellectual production that exists in the courts. And I'm really fascinated by that. That's what my book is on as well, but in the South. And one thing I wanted to raise is, of course, prisoners who were writ writers also sold their work to other prisoners. So there's an internal economy as well as an external dialogue that you highlight so well. So for each paper, I'm just going to issue a question, and then we can open this up and you can answer it or thread it into other questions. For Nathaniel, I wonder in his engagement with frivolity, which of course is what forecloses this era of writ writing in the Prison Litigation Reform Act, and Congress in 1996 more or less calls writ writing a frivolous pursuit. So that's an old argument. But does he take the court seriously? Does he take the law seriously? Or, as other scholars like Toussaint Lucier and Dan Berger have made the argument that they more or less put the state on trial through mockery. So that's a thought. I'm going to do each question and then we threaded into the discussion. Morgan's really interesting paper shows us that prison labor extends beyond prison and beyond the confines of walls to follow the role that companies played in extending coerced labor beyond one's actual incarceration to their period of parole. And that's a really fascinating and new idea, so thank you for sharing that with us, Morgan. That's a new twist. I guess my broad question is did businesses ever extend a prisoner's sentence? So are they involved in extending sentences? And do those that are involved in the parole system, do they get involved in sentencing changes at the political level? So I guess my question is what is their engagement with expanding incarceration or one's incarceration, and what is their role with the state and the politics of the decision to sentence? And then Todd's really interesting paper takes us into the present and the role that companies can play in giving people an opportunity to work, and thinks about the role that statistics can play in assessing this. I guess my question for you, Todd, is that beyond the initial hire, do you look and track at opportunity for promotion? Because these hires are going to be such at the bottom level that even once you get over that bar, is there ever any opportunity for someone who does good work to have a future beyond that initial entry level job? So with that, we'll just take questions, and if you like, you can answer my question now, or you can take questions from the audience. For each participant, that's your choice.
Okay, I'll answer your question.
Okay.
Chessman definitely takes the law very seriously. He is actually, I think, as far as my research has shown, one of the only people on death row to be given an extra cell. That was his workspace. So that's why he names his first memoir after that work site. So the reaction to his rhetoric, the reaction to the kind of presentation of self in the court space is sort of jaundiced by the view that I kind of articulated here. But he didn't necessarily use the theater, or use the courtroom as a kind of revolutionary theater space like Black Radical in the subsequent decade, in the 60s and the 70s. I think the people that wanted to put him to death felt he did, but he never actually sort of put the state on trial in a way that a lot of Bay Area, like Black Panthers and other Black revolutionaries would do. He did sort of fashion himself as a kind of legal mind, and took the law very seriously on its own grounds, rather than sort of say that this is a white man's law and it doesn't apply to my situation. Right? So yes, Chessman, I think, did fashion himself, or see himself as the kind of legal mind, legal scholar.
Yeah, I'll answer your questions as well. Thank you for the comments. The first question, I think, was, did businesses extend sentences? And the answer to that is no, unless they turned the paroled man or woman into a new crime. So unless they went to the penitentiary under a new sentence based on a report from an employer, right? So if they stole something from the business, the employer could then turn them in under a new sentence. And then, is the parole system involved in sentencing changes? Not in terms of the number of years that are assigned to an indeterminate sentence for a particular crime. So for example, robbery under the parole system or under the system in Illinois law would have been 1 to 20 years. So that's a huge range, right? It's reminiscent of George Jackson's sentence, of course, 1 to life. So the parole system is deeply involved in determining who gets out when, because the parole board decides who is paroled when and to whom. So they are involved in the length of time that a particular individual spends in prison. And so that indeterminate sentence in and of itself gives them a huge amount of power. And then, there's one other thing I was going to say to that. Oh yeah. In the late 1920s, Illinois experienced governor and the warden of the penitentiary are accused of actually selling paroles. And they did, the evidence suggests. So what happens after that is that social scientists from the Chicago School of Sociology are brought in to establish a prediction system to help the board figure out who should get out at what time. And this is statistical, and it's based very heavily on factors that are related to race, class, ethnicity, and that is created by the parole system, and it does influence the length of sentences in the late 1920s and 1930s. And that's a system that was later adopted by a lot of states in the US.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer your very thoughtful question, Robert. And we haven't looked at that particular issue in terms of is there essentially a penalty sort of going forward in terms of criminal record. Be interesting to take a look at it. Anecdotally, what I've observed with clients is that the further someone gets in their career, sort of those initial data points that the organization used to either screen them in or screen them out take on less importance. And what takes on more importance is what the person has actually been able to do in terms of producing results, and then also sort of their social network within the organization. So certainly would be interesting to know. Maybe that's a follow-on exploration.
Great. I'm sure you guys are all eager to join the conversation, so let's open it up to the room.
You were fabulous and really nicely brought together. I have a thought and a question. My thought is that Morgan, while you were speaking, I was thinking about how the linking of labor and citizenship rights. I hear that a lot now with immigration and immigrants who merit being here, not being here. And so that's an interesting connection, and I wonder what it suggests about the possibilities of labor as a way to confer citizenship, mobilization's possibilities. And my question for all of you is, for say somebody wanted to reform or abolish the prison system as it exists, how do you see your research possibly being leveraged toward that end, or where do you see you're working in different parts of this spectrum, education side, parole, reentry, employment? How do you see, I don't know, where do you see your work potentially fitting into that conversation?
So in the coda to my dissertation, which was written a long time ago at this point, I felt like what I wanted my research to do is to actually, at a very fundamental level, change the discourse around labor itself. When you read somebody like Jimmy Santiago Baca in his memoir discussing how he became literate in prison by basically like teaching himself to read, the language that he uses in that memoir about those incidents is physical labor. He would scribble and then erase and
in my research, I've noticed that citizenship rights are only conferred on an ex-prisoner when they've successfully completed their parole. So you can't vote until somebody signs off giving the okay for you to vote, and that's the warden who can bring you back to prison anytime he wants to. So that's a really great thought, and I'm going to try to explore that a little bit more going forward. So I think it's really wonderful that historians of the carceral state have been some of the most vocal in terms of making suggestions policy-wise for the current sort of era of mass incarceration that we find ourselves in, because the historical profession in general, often we're like very, very weary of actually like making predictions and suggestions. So I would say that my work cautions us to remember that things that look like rehabilitation sometimes aren't intended to be rehabilitative. The parole system is a very progressive reform. It's put in place to essentially spur rehabilitation outside prison walls, which is considered very important, just integrating people back into free society. But it ends up being used as a tool of oppression. And so I think that that's a valuable lesson that we should just remember going forward when we hear liberal policymakers making various suggestions. And then secondly, people have been calling to bring back parole, specifically for the federal system, because they don't have it anymore. They launched it in the 80s. I think it can be a good thing, but statistically it has led to longer sentence lengths, so people spending more time in prison than they otherwise would under a determinate sentence. So we need to just remember that when we think about parole and policy today.
Yeah, I can certainly hop in. Your question really made me think, which I generally don't like to do. I've sort of been thinking about the research more in terms of helping individuals and their families, and also organizations, because I don't want organizations to lose out on that talent and that productivity, right, from sort of an enlightened self-interest perspective. I suppose I haven't thought backwards in terms of any implications in terms of the criminal justice system itself. I am somewhat hopeful because certainly with larger companies at least, and this is migrating down to smaller companies, there's now more of a emphasis on making decisions in a data-driven way. So as organizations hire people, there are all sorts of myths that have sort of grown up around who's going to work out in a job and who isn't. But I think organizations these days are much more willing to actually look at the data, look at the evidence, and at least in most cases, let that drive their decision making. So if we can sort of get away from the realm of myth and more into, well, what do the numbers actually say, perhaps we'll all be better off.
Other questions? Yeah, I think the question for Morgan, that really entertaining example of Bain that you brought up, there's a sort of, looks like class bias thing there. I'm just wondering if you noticed or if it's anywhere treated in your, in the dissertation, how across gender lines or race lines, differentials of exploitation and treatment and stuff like that, did you deal with that at all?
Yes, I do a lot. And it is one of the great failures of this paper that I don't really mention it. I'd say, so in terms of gender, I'll take that one first. The curious thing that I found is that women are much more likely to be paroled more quickly than men, and they are much more likely to be paroled to family members, which can work as a double-edged sword, right? Because the conditions of a parole can be used to impose various gender roles on women. Say the woman has a very strict father and doesn't want her to work outside the home. He can sign her parole and say that she will be doing housework for him. Women are also often paroled to their husbands. And this does not happen the other way around. So men are generally not paroled to family members unless they are very young. And they are certainly not paroled to their wives. So that's one huge difference, I think, that comes about in terms of just the enforcement of gender roles and the patriarchal family structure. And then race-wise, statistically, black men and women serve longer sentences. They're paroled far less frequently than white men and women are. And I'm trying to develop a statistical sort of system to show that. I know it because of the anecdotal evidence, but I'm currently formulating the numbers. And then black men and women are usually not paroled to other black men and women. They're generally paroled to either white men or white women. Black men are often not paroled to white women. It's usually black women who are paroled for domestic labor. And then black men are often paroled to farms, basically because there is the sense that there is a danger of allowing certain people back into the city of Chicago, and a lot of those people are African Americans. The other interesting thing that I found is that a lot of black men who are Southern migrants, right, so this is during the period of the First Great Migration that some of my work is touching on, are paroled back to the South. So they have moved north, and they are trying to start their new lives, and then they get arrested and incarcerated, and they know that they can get out of prison earlier if they agree to go back to Georgia or Louisiana or Tennessee or wherever they came from. And so they take that opportunity, which is, I mean, it's really devastating to read about. But thank you for your question.
Other questions?
I was just scanning, it's Nathan. I have this feeling that I saw this made-for-TV movie, like in the 70s, where Alan Alda played Carol Chessman. Does this sound familiar?
No.
Which is surprising because this is the chapter that I started my second year in grad school in coursework, and then was the last chapter that I finished in my dissertation, which took 4, 5, 6 years to write. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a movie made up about Carol
It's
Chessman.
kind of like a made-for-TV thing, so I probably would never have.
Well, I mean, there were records released in the wake of his execution, like prior to his execution and after, that were trying to emancipate by playing folk music. He was on the cover of Time. Some sort of historians want to make a kind of implicit argument that his execution and the conversation around it kind of shaped electoral politics at the presidential level. I think Eisenhower was going to go visit some foreign country, I'm pretty sure Uruguay at one point, and he canceled the visit because he was afraid that people were protesting his presence in the country over the impending execution. So he had an outsized kind of cultural presence in the 50s, and then in the immediate wake. I don't know how far that extends, apparently it does.
IMDb reports that there's a Kill Me If You Can, a 1977 movie.
Kill Me If You Can.
Yeah.
And that was from here.
I did not know this.
Yeah.
I thought everything that
Probably
was
gonna
written.
invalidate everything you said.
Yeah.
You'll probably have to rewrite the whole book on this. But let me just comment. It's interesting because I've had to work with lawyers a lot lately with our labor union and our faculty union. And my experience of the lawyers is, you said that they were saying that Chessman's playing the game. It's usually the game part is actually what the lawyers know, because as I can tell from what you guys can read this stuff, the legal stuff, it's not that hard to understand.
Sure.
What the lawyers have is the inside knowledge of how the game is played. Like, oh, that arbitrator is famous for just flipping a coin. That sort of stuff. So the irony is, it's like, Chessman is the serious one in a lot of ways, and then the lawyers, some access to sort of this internal knowledge, and it's class bound, knowledge. It's like who gets let in.
Right. I mean, there's certain legal language scholars who have made a claim that the density of legal language in general, especially contracts and so forth, is professional gatekeeping. And you get credentials, you get validated as a lawyer in order to sort of exercise that discourse, and then you don't want anybody else doing it. And so to have this kind of arrogant Southern California dude trial during the day, so we couldn't prepare his defense for the next day. Because it was effectively a kind of coalition and system of people wanting those gates maintained at all costs. Right? But I mean, it does take a little while to start to read and teach yourself how to read, like especially grids. I think. Like,
well, we're close readers, you know. We can ultimately, I think, penetrate that in a way.
Sure.
What we don't have is access to what's going on down at the courthouse.
Right. Exactly.
Who knows how this judge behaves?
The relationships developed in law school that's sort of circulated in Sacramento or in LA or wherever have you. Yeah, those are the things that you never had any access to whatsoever.
Other questions? Yes.
I just found myself in all three thinking about alienation, and that might be obvious because it's like control, but you know, with Todd's paper, workers could be alienated. Like it's kind of like you know, you're hired, but we remember that you were in this category, so we're keeping an eye on you. So it's kind of like you could be in that situation, right? And so we're kind of trying to say, well, there's no good reason to keep that category there, so let's forget that and not break that down. With the parole issue, it's like, well, you're doing this labor, but you're not doing it for just the labor itself, but also for like the freedom, right? So it's an extra bit of distance from like owning, controlling your own labor. And then adjustment is laboring away as you're demonstrating, but then having it sort of like critiqued in that way that makes it like, well, it doesn't count, right? And this is all for naught. And so I just think that the concept of alienation is interesting here. That might be obvious with control in the legal system, but I think it could be useful for anyone else.
Other questions? Let's do the two together quickly, and then we're just about at time. So let's pair them together.
Yeah. Just a super quick one for Nathaniel. I'm so sorry, I missed almost all of your amazing presentation, but just from some of the comments that you said about the context of prison policy becoming so much more progressive, the stance towards education. I'm just curious if in your research you looked at anything like the Education and Justice Project out in Illinois.
Not that case, or not that particular instance.
But it seems like there are some people that are trying to fight against that trend. And I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean,
kind of like a broad assessment of.
I very much share Morgan's. I think the deeper you get into this topic, the more hesitant you want to make broad claims because any civil rights articulated in Gideon versus Wainwright, like landmark civil rights case, gives the indigent prisoner legal representation actually just helps to balloon the prison industrial complex because now they have PDs and they just get shunted into the system more quickly for longer if they take plea deals, right? Educational systems in prison, I think, have to be treated very carefully. For whose benefit? Are you a representative of the state? Are you getting paid by the state? Do you leverage your freedom to help them get out? Do you comply with all the systems of constraint and control? So there are great educational programs. I think you need to be exceptionally careful because I think the history and the literature and the prisoners' reactions often tell us that these things just become more apparatuses for control, right? And then there's a whole penal tourism thing that's also built into it. That's very icky too.
Last question, very quickly.
That's okay.
Okay, this was a great panel. We learned many things, including that I'm never going to see Hawkeye Piers quite the same way. So thank you very much.